Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today at Kindred Church. We're so glad that you have this time that you've dedicated to spend in worship with us. We're continuing to talk about Kindred's basic biblical beliefs today, and today we're going to be talking about our second core basic biblical belief, which is the idea of being a people who are called to love. So, as we're thinking about that idea, I had this question that just kind of keeps running through my brain. What does it mean to be all in? In what areas of life would I say that I'm all in? You know, in many ways, that the Bible coined that idea of being all in, committed totally to something. Jesus says that we are to give every aspect of ourselves over to God. We are to be all in as believers. As followers of Jesus, we're supposed to be completely and totally dedicated to Him. But the depth of our enthusiasm is different than just the term that's implemented in this world. We have a tendency to underdo things a lot of times. Our being all in goes beyond just being excited about a new idea or a product or a public figure. In Mark 12, Jesus explains what being all in with God really looks like. He says, starting in verse 30, the most important commandment is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord. And you must love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. So the first part of this, being called to love, we're told to, and we're called to love God with the entirety of our being. Now, this passage that Jesus is reference here is not some old, forgotten, or arbitrary command from thousands of years ago that Jesus was pulling from. Here, Jesus is attempting to connect with every Jew, right? He's connecting with every Jew from every education level with something that is very familiar. It's called the Shema. The Shema is a prayer that is recited every day by Israelites everywhere. This phrase was a part of their everyday life. And in many ways, it was a spiritual discipline that reminded them of their covenant with God. It comes from Deuteronomy 6, and it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, and He is alone our Lord. And you must love your Lord, the Lord your God, with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you're on the road, when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your foreheads as reminders. Write them on doorposts of your house and to your gates. So this was one of the most personal verses in all the Hebrew Bible. This passage is all about how God's people are meant to connect with Him, how they are to come to know Him in a more personal and a more intimate way, and how they are supposed to share this God-ordained relationship with the people who are in their everyday lives. So Israel was expected to serve Yahweh, and they're expected to serve Him alone. But their devotion was meant to be one of totality, right? They were to commit their whole being to loving God. This undivided life was expressed in that phrase of heart, mind, soul, and strength. So let's look at the parts of life and what it means to love God with the entirety of our being. The first one that Jesus references is heart. Now, ancient Israel understood the heart, or leb, not as the seat of emotion, which is what we mean. We refer to somebody like, I love you with all my heart. And we take that as, I love you from the deepest of emotions. but rather the Israelites, when they talk about the heart was the place where decisions are made. The heart is at the center of a person's being. And for the Israelite, the heart is where the intellect and the emotion and our will, all those things are combined together, and that's where decisions are made. The heart was also the moral center of a person. So, part of loving God with the entirety of our being is to love Him at the core of who we are. We're to love Him, and that should be shown in how we make every decision throughout our everyday lives. But this is not where our love for God ends. We're also called to love God with all of our soul. Now, that idea of soul is an interesting and often misunderstood concept, especially in our culture. My grandpa once said something which is pretty profound about the soul, even though he never called it the soul. It was something definitely far too profound for my 12-year-old person to really understand, but my 47-year-old person still remembers it because it's one of the last things that he ever told me. He said, "The person that no one else can see is the person that is really me." I don't know if that was his thing or if he was quoting somebody else, but that really explains what the ancient Israelites believed about the soul. And the word soul that is actually used is nephesh in the Hebrew, or psyche in the Greek. Now, when we talk about loving God with our soul, we are to love Him with the part that it's not a physical part of who we are, the part of ourselves we can't measure it, we can't see it. But to love God with my soul is to love God unreservedly with the very essence of my being, which is connected to the heart and also connected to the mind. Now, loving God with your mind is something that Jesus added to the original Shema, but the mind was very important to the first century people. The ability to think through a problem, the ability to reason was becoming more and more valuable as time went on. So when Jesus said to love God with all of your mind, it meant to love God with all of your thoughts, with all of your knowledge, with all of your intellect. And then to round out this love that comes from our decision making and from our psyche and from our thoughts and reason and intellect. We're now to round that out with this call to love God with all of our strength. And strength is kind of a weird translation of the original term, miod, which miod implies a person's full capacity. Miod is in the Shema has been translated to mean strength, but the actual meaning is more like much or very. It's an adverb to all you grammarians out there. So really what's being called here is we are to love God with all of our muchness, okay? The Hebrew commentary written by F.F. Bruce says, loving God with all of our strength is really about loving God with all of our muchness and devoting every opportunity, every possibility, and capacity to have honoring God. So everything, every opportunity, possibility, capacity you have, use that to honor God. So this goes far beyond just loving God with our physical strength. And when we put all these together, right? When we put the heart and the mind and the soul and the strength, we put all these together, we're referencing the entirety of the human being. And we're to love God with everything that we are, with everything that we do, to love God with everything that we think, everything that we say, and everything that we have. Now, even though these four concepts seem to describe different compartments of a person's life, the intention was never to imply that we could love God with our heart, but not love God also with our mind and resources. These four things, heart, soul, mind, and strength, make up the entirety of what it means to be human. And as human beings, we are whole persons. The force of the heart and soul and mind and strength requires a devotion that is single-minded and complete. And we're to be able to do this when we're able to finally love somebody or something with the entirety of our being. Something very special happens. We become like Christ, because that's exactly how Jesus lived his life. He loved God. He loved his heavenly Father with everything that he was. So what does that look like? What does loving God with the entirety of your being really look like in your everyday life? What does it look like to be all in with God? So as you go through the rest of your day, as you go through living that everyday life, think about what you're doing. Think about how you're treating people. Think about the words that you're saying, and then ask yourself, is this what it really looks like to love God with the entirety of my being? Because of all the virtues that are meant to be in the Christian life, love is considered the most important. So let's listen once again to Jesus' words. Jesus replied, "The most important commandment is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is the one and only Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And the second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these." So Jesus explains that the greatest commandment is to love God with the entirety of our being, but he doesn't stop there. He doesn't end with just the Shema. Jesus then says that you shall love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So we are called to love God with everything, but we're also called to love people. In other words, it isn't enough to just love God. We must also direct that love outwardly towards other people. In fact, when you really dig into the way that of Christ, when you dig in to not only what Christ taught, but also to the way that Jesus lived his life, and when we look at that, we can see that it is impossible to fully love God. It's impossible to love God with all of your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and not show that same holistic love to other people. So it just isn't enough to love God. We must direct the love we have for God outward towards other people. But then Jesus tells us to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And that can be kind of a tricky idea. Loving another person as I love myself. So how do you love yourself? How do we love ourselves? This isn't about being selfish. That's not what this is about in any ways. Please don't confuse what Jesus is saying here with being selfish. Loving ourselves is about self-care, right? One of my favorite theologians, Fred Rogers, otherwise known as Mr. Rogers, he said this years ago on one of his shows: "The toughest thing is to love somebody who has done something mean to you, especially when that somebody is yourself." Have you done anything mean to yourself? Well, it's very important to look inside yourself and find that loving part of you. That's the part of you you must take good care of and never be mean to, because that's the part of you that allows you to love your neighbor. And your neighbor is anyone who you happen to be with at any time in your life. Respecting and loving your neighbor can give everybody a good feeling. And as usual, Mr. Rogers is so right. We have to pay close attention to the part of ourselves which gives us the capacity to love. And in doing so, we must find a way to love ourselves. It's very important to find that part, because that's where love resides. And we must take care of our heart. We must take care of our soul. We must take care of our mind and our strength, because that's the part of you that allows you to not only love God, but love your neighbor. And that love is where faith is activated. James 2 says this: what good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see someone who has no food or clothing, or you say, goodbye and have a good day, stay warm and eat well, but then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? You see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. So James is addressing a church that is very diverse. It has a very diverse socioeconomic culture. The church members would play favoritism oftentimes. They were kind and pleasant to those who were wealthy, and they would neglect the members who were in need. So James emphasized that real faith works. Real faith puts forth action. Real faith and really loving God and your neighbor doesn't just cultivate heartfelt praise or theological belief. Real love, real faith is expressed in the service of others. Our faith and love must have action to express its belief and its passionate convictions. The love we have for God must be shown by genuinely caring for the people God has placed in our everyday lives. So our faith is to be centered around loving God, meaning this is a very personal, intimate relationship. But it would be impossible to have the full extent of a relationship that we're supposed to have if my heart is filled with hatred of others or hatred of myself. Because loving God with every aspect of my being helps me to share that love with a neighbor. So I want to close today with a very familiar story. It is one Jesus used to summarize what we have been talking about. And what does it really mean to not only love God, but to love our neighbor? Jesus explained it this way. He said, one day, a Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. This was known as being a very dangerous road for travelers. Halfway down the mountain, some thugs jumped this man who was traveling. They robbed him. They beat him almost to the point of death. And then they left him naked on the side of the road with no provisions. He was just left there to cook in the sun and die. And as he laid there, we're told that a priest saw him laying in that ditch. So this priest, instead of helping, crossed over to the other side of the road because he just couldn't be dirtied by this unclean man. And soon afterwards, a Levite. Levite was kind of a deacon in those days. He saw him laying on the side of the road, but he was just too busy, so he walked on by. But then a Samaritan, who would have seen on every other day, who would have seen this Jewish man as kind of an enemy of sorts, he's the one that stopped to check on him. He risked his own safety, considering the same thugs that had jumped this and beat this man up were probably still in the area, but he risked his own safety to help this person who was in need. He knew that's what he needed to do. So he cleaned and bandaged this man's wounds. He put his clothes on this man and helped him by giving him something to drink. And then he put him on his donkey. And when they got to Jericho, we're told that he paid for the stranger's room in a hotel and made sure that he would be taken care of. In other words, this Samaritan emptied himself of his own resources, his own safety, his own comfort, not only for a stranger, but for someone who would have seen him as an enemy. This Samaritan, who was a follower of God, understood the Shema. And because he loved God with his entirety of his being, because he loved God with all of his heart, with all of his mind, with all of his soul, and all of his strength, he then poured out his love onto a person that he saw as a neighbor. And that's what it means to be a follower of Christ. And that's what we are seeking to do here at Kindred. We want to love God with everything that we are. We want to love God with everything that we do, with everything that we have. And because of that love, we want to pour that love into other people's hearts. I want to thank you for joining us today. We'll continue this discussion next week as we discuss that all are welcome. And I really hope that you have a blessed day.